And get rolling here. Our final talk of the afternoon. Okay? So please welcome NC0B Rob Sherwood.
Okay. All right. And by the way, I got 1 hour sleep last night, so if I doze off, somebody kick me. So we're going to be talking about rig comparisons and some specs. I can't cover everything, but there are past CTUs on the web. So nothing has changed from the basic idea of we want to copy that weak guy surrounded with strong stations, and you really do need a better receiver for CW than you do for sideband, and I'll explain why that is. And we're talking about contest observations from October through February. And then a little bit on published data and what you should make of it. So here's the rig. So here's the rigs I used from October to February, and quite a range in price and brands there. And it's quite really an interesting thing to be able to try these rigs in the real world. So here's where I ran the Kenwood 990 and CQ Worldwide. We're kind of echoey there. In the ARRL 160 in December, and then the following week in the 10-meter contest was the Flex 6700, the Apache Anon in the W1BB contest. Actually, I initially planned to run the KX3 then, but I didn't have the special cable, so I had 1 day to get the Anon up and running. And then the new version of the TS-590, which 3 years ago I used the 590S in a CW contest, so this year I ran the 590SG in a sideband contest. All rigs are driving an Alpha 89. That's a manual tune version of an 87A pin diode QSK, so you really get to test out that. So the 990, as you probably know, it's a down conversion rig on all bands, unlike the 590. So there's no compromise there. It's about an S unit cleaner on transmit IMD because it has a 50-volt PA, and that's something we should all be happy with. The cleaner we can have the bands, the better. The band scope's quite effective, but it's not as high resolution as an SDR. But it's, for instance, significantly better than my 781. The audio is quite clean, low fatigue. I was very pleased with that because, at least for me, anything that adds to the fatigue I don't want, whether it's distortion, noise, this type of thing, AGC problems. So fatigue is a big deal for me. The reciprocal mixing dynamic range, if you're not familiar with that, that's phase noise basically. That's its weakest link. Its number, it's fine. It's in the 85 dB range and up, somewhat band dependent, but that's its weakest point. And that's somewhat occurred because of the way testing had been done since 2007, but I won't get into that today. It's been a lot of complaints if you read the Yahoo 990 reflector about noise blanking and noise reduction not being up to par. And they just announced in the last day or two a new firmware update, I think 1.1. I haven't installed 1.1, it just came out. The 6700, that's their top of the line, and the band scope is really great. You can see signals on CW that you can't copy, which you say, well, why do you want to see that? Well, you don't have to waste your time on a signal that you can't copy. So in my case, with the typical span of like 22 to 24 kilohertz, if the signal was 5 dB above band noise, I knew I couldn't copy it. And towards the end of the contest, I was just trying to find some cues. I didn't waste my time. But if it was 10 dB above, I could copy it. Now, why is that? Because the resolution of the band scope is like 15 hertz. So it can see down into the noise when I'm using, say, a 200 hertz filter on CW. So that's how that works. I tuned it with a flex control. For the tuning knob, it has some buttons, which by the time 1.38 came out, it was beginning to be useful. I wish all the 3 buttons were knobs. If you have to push a button, push the tuning knob, adjust something else, push the knob again, push a button, that's crazy. And I think Frank was just talking about user interface here just a moment ago, and that to me, way too much. In a contest, you can't be pushing buttons 4 times. But maybe somebody will come up with like the, I think it's called DJ console, and if they could interface that to the Flex, maybe that'd be a good solution. I've used 2 computers. I ran this rig actually January of last year, January of this year, and then twice in December. The software in January is quite primitive, but because of focus problems, I use 2 computers. So N1MM talking to the radio with SmartCat, and then a separate computer to do actually running the radio. That worked fine for me. With the newer software, I think 1.4 and newer, and 1.4.1.1 just shipped yesterday. That's not necessary anymore, but I haven't used it, so I can't comment on how well that works. If you have plenty of real estate, I suppose a really big wide monitor, if you solve the focus problem, then you don't need 2 computers. I'm sure most people don't want to run 2 computers. The Apache Anon, I had a 100D a while ago, and it had problems with dithering, raising the noise floor, and so I didn't really publish any data on it. And then the 200 shipped last year. I got one right after Dayton, and it had the same problem, which I was shocked. And after about 6 months, they finally shipped me a new clock, and the 122 megahertz clock, and that solved the problem. I put it on the air in the Stu Perry contest, and the selectivity was absolutely abysmal. Luckily, Warren NR0B was in Colorado, and I called him up on the phone and said, "What's going on here?" And he said, "Well, go adjust this and that." And I'll tell you a little bit more later, but we got that fixed. I tuned it with the flex knob. All I could get to work was the tuning, so I didn't have any buttons or anything like that. The band scope is quite good, and I could have been able to see below band noise if I'd known how to adjust it. But I switched to this rig for that contest 24 hours before the contest, and I didn't know you could adjust it, and I'm just happy to get N1M talking to it and all that working. So, that's the way it was. Focus was a disaster. I used 1 computer, a dual head video card, 2 19-inch monitors, and I'd adjust something on the radio, and then I'd occasionally forget to click back on N1MM. I'd hit a key or I'd hit the mouse or something, and boom, I'm on 3 megahertz, I'm on the broadcast band. Oh, I can't tell you how many times I was, saying words that maybe don't broadcast on the air. But it was a CW contest, so it didn't work. I just got an email from Warren like 2 hours ago, and they've shipped version 3.2.36, and that's supposed to have it fixed. Obviously, I haven't tried it out, but they're still called Power SDR, but it's like 98% been rewritten by Warren and several other people. So it's really its own software, for its own radio. So the selectivity was so bad that I stopped in the middle of the contest, fired up some of the lab equipment, measured the shape factor of my 200 hertz filter where I'd normally run S&P, and it was 4:1. Well, heck, we haven't had 4:1 shape factors for how many decades? So Warren had me go in and change a buffer type, the buffer size, and I measured it again, 1.6. Okay, that's pretty good. So you can see why it wasn't performing well. Once the selectivity worked, the audio peak filter, the APF filter, worked very well. Adjustable bandwidth, adjustable gain. I like a 4 dB increase in gain and about a bandwidth of 1 to 200 hertz. But you can set it everywhere you want. It's open source software if you're into that type of thing. And they did ship some new noise reduction software in March. And I don't have much noise out there in the middle of nowhere, so I haven't really heard that. On this selectivity thing, if you're tuning with, say, within a filter bandwidth of a real strong CW signal, you should not hear the signal. You should just hear his key clicks. Now, hopefully his key clicks aren't terrible, which some are, but that was what was the cue that, there's something wrong here, because I just kept hearing, I never heard key clicks. I just heard the signal on the slope of the filter. So that once I, fixed it, then all of a sudden I was happy camper. The next radio I used in the January CQ 160 CW contest with the KX3. I had run that 2 years ago with just the KX3, driving the alpha, putting out 12 watts meant the alpha put out a monstrous 300 watts. So I was in the high power class, but I wasn't exactly high power. So this year I borrowed the companion 100-watt amp, and a lot of custom cables that you buy from Elecraft, and it hooks up just fine. And I was able to, of course, run full power. The limitation on the KX3, it's a phasing rig. How many people remember the 20A? That's a phasing transmitter. Well, it's the same thing with the KX3. You have to null phase and amplitude it, null out the opposite sideband. You can null it down on one frequency like 72 dB, but in general it's down about 60. That could be a problem. I didn't hear it tune backwards, because if you would be hearing the opposite sideband, it would tune backwards as far as which way the pitch goes, but I didn't actually hear that happen, but it certainly could. So from a QRP standpoint of the 3 rigs I've used, the 703 Plus, which I really like on sideband with an optional narrower filter, or the Argonaut, which works on CW and sideband both, I felt the KX3 was quite good. But I had a problem. I have a fairly narrow 160 meter antenna. I presume many of us do. And so once I QSY about 20 kilohertz, I got to retune it. Normally I would just flick the alpha into standby, let the rig fold back on SWR, tune my remote tune Alt network tuner, and then flick the alpha back on. Well, the amplifier in the companion 100-watt amp didn't like it. It would lock up. I'd have to power cycle it. So what I just did was reach over to the power button, turn it down to like 9 watts. It drops off the the companion amplifier, and I'm just driving the alpha with 9 watts so I can tune the SWR. So that worked out all right as a workaround. I don't know why that's a problem, but that was. Surprisingly, you don't normally run preamps on 160 meters, but during the day, like at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday when the contest is going, I had to run the 10 dB preamp, and Elecraft says that's normal, that's just the gain distribution. When I ran it in Easter Island, I don't know if some of you saw the little presentation I was running during lunch, I ran the 10 dB preamp on 10 and 15 meters on Easter Island with my Mouthster's antenna system inverted V. There's the rig that was on Easter Island, but of course when I had it up at east of Fort Collins, I wasn't running it on battery. The 590SG is a modest improvement over the S. It has some new features. The phase noise is a little bit better, so it actually came up on my chart, if you've been on my website, to within the top 10. But you know, if you already own an S, unless the new features are important to you, I probably would stay with the S. N2IC, maybe you guys have heard of him. He kind of wins a lot of contests, or top 10 for sure. He has a pair of the 590Ss, and he runs SO2R. So obviously, for a rig that you could probably buy a 590S for $1,000, that's a lot of radio. The DSP was quite handy to use on sideband. I would adjust the low cutoff and the high cutoff depending on the QRM, and sometimes I'd copy better. The QRM wasn't bad by widening it out a little bit, but other times I couldn't do that. And in CW, when I ran the S, tended to run it around 200 hertz back 3 years ago. The ergonomics are pretty good. I felt it was not too many stumbling blocks, but you do have to use the multifunction knob a lot. So that's sort of the overview. There's radios I got to run this contest season. Now let's talk about a spec. What one spec, I mean, everybody talks about dynamic range, and you say, well, noise floor is maybe it's not important, or maybe it is. So I think it's somewhat misunderstood. Most bands, most of the time, now low bands at night, or the higher bands, particularly 20 and 15 during the day, the receivers have a noise floor that's more than adequate. And certainly on like 80 meters, this is totally a non-issue during the evening. So we really need to have the concept, what is our noise level, and it certainly depends where you live, versus the noise floor of the receiver. So in your ARRL handbook, there's an ITU graph that's very handy. I'll show you in a moment. And its data is in a 500 hertz bandwidth, which is what all the data we see in QST or on my website or RSGB for the most part. So we don't have to do any extrapolating. Now this top line here, the dark one, that's supposedly an urban noise level. I would guess that that's worse than that for most of us. I've lived in Denver for 40 years, and I think my noise level has gone up about an S unit per decade. So if your neighbor's got a plasma TV, or you've got 92 warwards, which I believe we heard about this morning. You know, who knows what your noise level is. The dash line is considered rural, and that's a very good number for typical. The high bands, which are beam pointed in the direction of the most noise, which in my case in Colorado is usually either the Caribbean or east, and the nighttime on the low bands would be the dashed line. The dotted line, which is, they said quiet rural, but I find that I can be quiet rural on really rare occasions. It really just has to do with the conditions. So you can see that's quite a range. Now, people will call me up and say, I want to work more DX, and what radio should I buy to hear better? And the first thing I'll ask them is, what's your antenna? And they maybe say a G5RV or a 14 AVQ, and I think, well, maybe you should start there. And maybe they can and maybe they can't. Maybe there's restrictions where they live, or maybe the XYL doesn't want to have an antenna you can see, so who knows. But we don't usually want to be worrying, well, I'm going to go buy a radio that has a minus 140 dBm versus a mic of minus 135 or 130. That's really not where we should be paying attention. But again, we have to say, are we talking about worst case or sort of typical? 20 meters in a rural environment. I'm 35 miles east of Fort Collins, 10 acres, the nearest neighbor has cows. The typical band noise during the day in the noisiest direction is about minus 110. Well, the typical receiver is like 20 to 30 dB quieter than that. So that's not a problem. On the low bands, particularly if your S meter is reading up scale on band noise, which on sideband you're almost always going to be the case, well, there's no point in that. Punch in a 6 dB attenuator, 10 dB attenuator, whatever, and bring that down to make the best use of your radio. Also, beam heading really makes a difference. Hopefully most of you have a beam, because I think one of our presenters was saying the difference from going from a dipole to a beam is just staggering. So take advantage of it if you can. But the easy 10 dB difference in as you spin your beam around. In my case, if the typical noise is towards the Caribbean, and then I turn the beam around to, say, Alaska/JA, easily drop 10 dB, 12 dB. I might even think the band's dead. But then I have a schedule with Alaska every week, and Mike comes in on 10/9, and I thought the band was dead. So just because it's quiet in that direction doesn't mean it's dead. It's quieter in certain directions. There's data off the table of a typical band noise, and you can see the difference, massive, over 30 dB. So for 40, 80, and 160, that would be nighttime noise. And on 20 meters and up, that would be typical daytime noise when the band's open. So what I was surprised, though, I started making measurements actually for Flex on what's the noise level at my QTH. And during the January 2014 CQ contest, I had just finished working JAs on 160, and I measured the noise level at 8 o'clock, and it was minus 105. That's almost as quiet as 20 meters during the day, which was typically minus 109 or 110. So that was kind of surprising, because I just worked a JA in the last 15 minutes. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it had only gone up to minus 101, but by 6:30 it was minus 91. So who knows, later in the night it could have even gone up. So there's the typical number off the chart, minus 87, so that has good correlation. Then you look at the measurements I made in 2013 for Gerald at different beam headings on 15 and 10, and you can see that I'm within 1 dB of the number in the chart in the noisiest direction. So that's a really good starting point to say, okay, what's typical for a rural environment? You know, the sun perks up and makes a lot of noise, so it can be louder than that, or we can have quiet conditions. So that's just, I say, a starting point. What I was really surprised at in the 10-meter contest this December, I was working in the last 2 hours of the contest, JA, VK, and ZLs. 5-element monoband Yagi at 65 feet, hardline, and their signals were okay, but because in that contest, US stations can call me, I was getting all sorts of stations calling me on backscatter. that were just copyable. And this was with the preamp, in this case on the Flex. So the noise floor, because I was on sideband, but the noise floor at reference to 500 hertz was actually down, the band noise was quiet rural. And the receiver was just barely adequate. I would have liked another couple of dB of lower noise. So that was the quietest I think I'd ever seen it when I was working DX. So that was astounding. So again, the quiet noise, quiet rural versus rural really depended on band conditions and the direction in this case. The other surprising thing was how quiet it can be on 80 meters. Now this was between about 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. So that's not optimum time, but you certainly can be working some things in the later morning and the early afternoon. When there were stations I was copying and the band noise was minus 120. Well, you'd like your receiver to be 8 to 10 dB quieter than the band noise so that it has minimal effect on reception. So with the preamp off, you get typical radios like minus 128, minus 30, 130. So in this case, it all totally made sense. I was able to copy a station on 3970 on a radio with a standard noise floor about minus 130. It happened to be a 781, and another radio that was minus 118, and I couldn't copy it at all. I was just shocked. So it really is all over the map depending on time of day in this case. Of course, the other things are, well, what kind of RFI do we have from your own shack? I know when I'm really getting serious about a contest, sometimes my wife stays home in Denver and I'm out in the country and I unplug things because really there's plenty of noise being generated in the typical house, let alone your neighbor. And if your neighbor has a plasma TV, which I think aren't being sold anymore, like maybe they'll all die off in the next 5 years. So here's sort of typical noise floors. Let's just look at the K3 because it's in the middle of my data set. So you can see there about minus 130, maybe to 133, the one I just tested a week ago, to a minus 138, minus 139. And so those are typical legacy radios, up conversion, down conversion, and we really can use those minus 130 type noise floors of the receiver at certain times of day on the lower bands. Now at nighttime on 40 meters, the band noise is about minus 100, so that minus 130 is crazy. So punch in your attenuator if you think you're in an overload situation, or you just don't want the band noise coming up. There's really no reason to have a guy stops talking for a minute, or the CW station quits transmitting for 2 seconds, and you don't really want band noise to be as loud as he was. That's tiring. Fatigue is really a problem for me, and I think for most of us, if we don't have those fatigue factors, we can do better in the contest. Your preamp most of the time shouldn't be necessary on 20, probably on occasion. And I can't imagine using a preamp on 40 meters at night if you're using your transmit antenna. Now I have a Yagi and an extended double zip, but if you've got a beverage or something like that, well, that's a different story. So just make common sense of this. A lot of radios today have an RX input for a receive-only antenna. I have a loop. I don't have the room in the right directions to do a beverage. Now, a beverage usually would require a head amp or something for impedance matching, and maybe it's just a transformer, a toroid, or something like that. So of course then a preamp makes sense, and so just see what seems logical. When do these examples not really apply? Well, we've got direct sampling radios now, the SDR. The first one out was the Perseus, and I know Tim had a whole stack of them for CW skimmer, and just a receiver, of course, but we kind of got used to this new concept then. And the Apache and the Flex, it's totally different. In case of the Flex, the antenna can go right into the A to D. Talk about a difference. But what's the difference there between the Flex, for instance, and the classic radio, Icom, whatever? The noise floor is much higher with no preamp, but it has a preamp you can turn on in the high bands when you need it, as opposed to the average radio that we've been using for 40 years is really designed for 10 meters. So it's got, for normal operating, particularly at night on the lower bands, well, we need to be putting some attenuation in there. Now the Apache is different. It has a different A to D, and you just can't hook the antenna up to it. So it's got a preamp as a buffer, but then it's got an attenuator on the input to the preamp. Now, I'm not a big fan of attenuators in front of preamps, because if you put a 10 dB pad in front of a preamp, you increase the noise figure 10 dB, but that's the way it works. And that's the way the attenuator in the Flex works also, unless you're on 20 dB, in which case it's just right in, and that's okay. So here's some comparisons. Let's just look at the Elecraft again, since it's the average. And so we see the Flex minus 118, which is probably okay on 20 most of the time. If the band noise is 109, 110, the receiver's 8 to 10 dB quieter, that's fine, but of course at sometimes you'll punch in the preamp. And just the opposite of the K3, which you wouldn't normally be using that on 20. So any classic radio, up conversion, down conversion, it's got a different gain distribution. And where it's just sort of the inverse for the direct sampling radios. So how do we choose a transceiver? Well, at night, most of the time they're too sensitive, so use the attenuator. We've got whatever dynamic range we have. We can move that around. I mean, it's fixed. Like, let's just say it's 80 dB. Most of the time that's going to be fine, but if we are punching in the preamp when we don't need it, well, then we've defeated the benefits of the radio. One of the gentlemen here several years ago, this is my 8th year here, I talked about this, and he said, I was flabbergasted. I was on 75 meters. My S meter on noise was reading S7, and I couldn't copy very well, so I turned the preamp on. Of course, the band noise went up to S9, and he thought that would make it better. Well, that was backwards, but it, just what sort of seems logical. So anyway, just keep that in mind. I can't talk about dynamic range today, but if you want to look at some of the presentations at the end of it, you'll got some web addresses talking about dynamic range. You might enjoy that. But the league's now publishing reciprocal mixing dynamic range, which would equal the measurements I've made for the last 40 years, or the QST measurements from 2006 back. So you can compare those. And that's kind of the worst case. And there's a really good sidebar in QST by Bob Allison, April 2012. If you don't have the magazine handy, but you are a member, if you look up the Icom 9100 review on the web, you can read Bob's sidebar. And then it's definitely worth reading to get an idea what that's all about. Of course, everything today, we have to deal with everyone's advertising their product. They're going to put the best face possible on it. So it's kind of a numbers game. I mean, would I say, well, I've got a 95 dB radio, and I really want a 100 dB radio. Would I change my radio because of that? I mean, that'd be sort of crazy. We have to look at what's reasonable, just like, is it reasonable to, well, what kind of money you're going to spend on your tower? You have to consider what's reasonable. So we don't want to get carried away. I mean, there was actually people called me up when the KX3 was about 2 or 3 dB higher than the K3, and they said, oh, I should sell my K3 and buy a KX3. Well, that was just sort of a testing anomaly. So again, you just have to look at the big picture. There's no way in the lab with 2, 3, 4 signal generators I can approximate CQ worldwide CW. I mean, that's just massive. Like, what did Doug say? We destroy the band. So I can't destroy a radio that way in the lab. So you need to know the numbers and can rule out a radio that's 60 dB or something. And really 70 dB is not really adequate on CW, but maybe sideband. So, but you got to get input from you guys. What are you using? What did you buy and sold? So we need input from the community. So when is reciprocal mixing dynamic range phase noise going to be a problem? Well, for most of us, the worst time we ever probably operate is if we participate in field day. We've got, assuming it's not just a one transmitter environment, we've got antennas close together. We got several transmitters, at least 2, maybe 5 transmitters on the air at the same time. And there's where phase noise will really raise its ugly head, and particularly if we're running CW in sideband, or maybe CW digital in sideband, all in 20 meters. So that can really separate the the wheat from the chaff. A few years ago, I gave a little data on some engineers at the Boulder Amateur Radio Club did some testing to compare two of the older Flex, not the new ones, the older Flex, 3000, 5000 to K3 as far as phase noise in the same band, 20 and 40, 20 dB better. Now the K3 is even better than that. So field day is really tough. Multi-multi, I mean, of course, if you're multi-multi, you're going to have filters and all that, but if your transmitter is producing phase noise and your receiver has the problem and you've got a spotter, you know, a mult station, well, then there's going to be a problem there. Or maybe you have a neighbor. I mean, on 160, if you got a big vertical and you got a neighbor a mile away, boy, that's a big problem. So in Boulder, there's a ham that's just up in the foothills, and he's been running a MP1000 for years. And there's another ham that's actually has the club station for the W0DK, and they're both on 15 meters, no problem. And the gentleman up the foothills got a FDDX 3000, and the other station over S9 phase noise over the entire 15 meter band. I don't know at the moment if that's just a bad sample, because we just never had another one to try it, but that's the type of thing that certainly is a problem. You know, be a good neighbor. Well, if you're wiping out the band, not much of a good neighbor. And it can be splatter, overdrive your linear, terrible key clicks, you set the rise time too fast, transmitted phase noise, whatever. So we really need to be worried about that, as we talked about in the first presentation this morning. On the 4 radios on the top of my chart, which is sorted by close-in dynamic range, and that's just one figure, but that's really important for CW. The Flex 6700 or the 6500, the Elecraft K3 or the KX3, and the Hilberling are really outstanding in that respect. And the really nice thing is, if you do own a K3 or considering it, and by the way, there's something new coming out you'll see tomorrow, which just got announced on the web today, but you can put the new synthesizer in the K3 for under 200 bucks, and it will improve it 15 to 20 dB. It will no longer be reciprocal mixing dynamic range limited, which is fantastic. And for 200 bucks, anybody should do it. The thing that now is, everything has a weak link. Tim, you may need to rest. Sorry about that. Okay, so everything has a weak link. If it was reciprocal mixing, that's it. If the reciprocal mixing is the limit, then why spend more money on mixers and things like that? But now, for instance, it's in the case of the K3, and I was testing that, the synthesizer is no longer the weak link, but now I'm noticing in it passive intermod in the roofing filters. But I've seen it otherwise too. In the Orion 2, I saw it. In the 990S, on the loaner I had for a year, the 500 hertz filter had some passive intermod. Its 270 did not, and the 2.7 did not. So there was always going to be a weak link, but it's interesting now that we can say, okay, we've improved the synthesizer, we've improved our mixers and all that kind of stuff, and now just the roofing filter can be the limit. Of course, an SDR radio doesn't have a roofing filter, but then it's got other distortion products. In one of the filters that I just tested, when I would hit it, I'd tune in real near the test signal, which was not enormously strong, minus 30 dBm. That's about 40 over 9. And then I tuned back to the intermod product. The intermod was 30 dB higher for the first few seconds, and it'd slowly come down over 10 or 15 seconds, and then it'd drop another 10 dB over another minute. And finally, 10 minutes later, it'd go back to normal. So that was kind of shocking. So that was not a very good filter. So we just have to know that we have a numbers game, and there's variables in there. I keep talking about fatigue. How do we cope with noisy bands? And I like to be able to set my either AGC threshold, if that's adjustable, which like in Orion 2 it is, and in a Flex it is, or you just use the RF gain. I'd like to be able to punch in, say, 6 dB of attenuation or 6 dB additional attenuation if I'm already running a little bit, and the band noise should go down noticeably. That way, most of the time when there's a slight pause in transmission, I don't care if it's sideband or CW, the AGC doesn't bring the band noise up to as loud as the signal I was listening to. Now, there were times when I was running the KX3 that I'd have to tweak the AGC threshold because I was working on somebody really weak, but most of the time I would take that trade-off, less fatigue, less noise coming up here in between every space, and that helps for me. Also, if your receiver has hum or hiss, now hum is probably not a big problem today, but hiss can be. I know some of the Yaesu, people complain about wideband hiss. Well, if I'm on CW and I take one of these speakers, almost all the brands have a speaker with filters in it. If I'm on CW and if there's wideband hiss that's after the selectivity, punch in the roll-off at 1 kc, I don't have to listen to that. So, make use of that. And I just plug my headphones into the speaker, even though the speaker is just now acting as an audio filter. All receivers have drastically improved. Once the Orion 2 came out, or the Orion 1, I guess, in 2003, and then, of course, K3 came along in 2008. And now we've just been getting better and better and better, close in. I mean, for a long time, all your receivers that were up conversion for 20 years, between like 80 and 2000, 1980 to 2000, were 100 dB radios, or close to it wide space, but close in they were 70. But now the receivers are a lot better, but the transmitters really haven't improved much. And I got a call from my only closest neighbor, Ham, AI0L. He's 13 miles away, and he was getting complaints of being wide. And he had a modern rig that was an amplifier that are still current products. And I said, well, I'm not really surprised because I tested the rig before. And so we got on the air on 10 meters and 15 meters. I pointed my 5-element beams at his stack or his stepper. And so we were 15/9 barefoot. He was 15/9 barefoot. And if he had the linear on, I punched in a 10 dB pad. So he was still 15/9. Then we tried different combinations of rigs and amplifiers and all that. So combo A, which was a current rig and a current solid state amp, when I listened to the opposite sideband, the crud was S8. Then he picked a 30-year-old rig, which was the same OEM, and a modified alpha that went from 8874s to 3CX800s, and the crud on the opposite sideband dropped from S8 to S2. So that's astounding, and he sold both the rig and the amplifier the next day, bought a different rig. So the transmitters are an issue. So you've probably all seen two-tone tests in QST, and that's fine. I do that too. But you can also look at it with white noise, band-limited white noise, which kind of gives you a worst-case scenario. So this rig, I'm not making fun of it. It's just one I tested with my new little noise generator. Now, you don't transmit white noise or band-limited white noise, but when you're saying CQ contest, you probably got pre-emphasis on your mic, either the mic choice or in your EQ. And so when you're saying those sibilant sounds, that's when you're going to be broad. So look at this, 3 kcs from the edge of the filter, we're only down about 40 dB. Well, maybe you say that's exaggerated, so say the typical speech is going to be down 50 dB or even 60 dB, probably not, but well, most radios for 20 years between 1980 and 2000 were 70 dB radios. So if the distortion products are 40, 50, 60 dB down, it's not the radio, it's the limit. That's what's sad, that we can't be cleaner than that. Yaesu has some Class A rigs, and if you run them with no compression, and no processing, and no ALC, they can be astoundingly clean, but most rigs are not. It's kind of funny to me that today, almost all rigs run on 13.8 volts, even rigs you'll never put in your car, never put in your boat. And now we've got all sorts of transistors, LD MOS that are at 50 volts would be at least an S unit cleaner. But the cleanest transmitter I ever owned was a brand new, well, slightly old 32S3. There's what it looks like on a classic two-tone test. Third order product, minus 36, the right way to measure it, like we always used to do if you were doing lab measurements. But if you do it against PEP, simple, you add 6 dB. So that would be 42 dB on third order. And the seventh order would be 66. So, and look, they go away pretty quickly, about only take up slightly more than half the screen. Well, there's a typical 13.8 volt rig. I'm not picking on that one, that's just typical. And so look, it's significantly worse. And so even modern stuff today that's brand new still tends around 13.8 volts for the most part, particularly if it has an external power supply. So the question is, to clean up the bands, would you pay another $100 or $200 for a cleaner rig? I know I talked to some of the OEMs in the US and say, well, why don't you put a 50 volt PA in here? And they say they won't buy it. So I don't know if you'll buy it or not, but it seemed like it'd be really good if we would have a cleaner transmitter. And then of course, we want to drive our linear properly. Now there is a solution to this that's not requiring a change, but it's complicated. It's called predistortion. You can sample the output of the rig, or even better, the output of your linear, and you have to have a sampler to knock it down 40, 50, 60 dB and feed that back into the rig. It knows how to deal with it. As far as I know, the Annon's the only one that has that, although there is something out of Europe that's like a 45 watt rig that has it built in. But it can make quite a difference. The improvement is significant. Look here at, this was the Annon 100, and this was a 6 meter Acom. The third order was down like 50 dB as opposed to 30, but it's kind of complicated. And the software for the Annon that Warren's written, called Pure Signal, they even made a new update to that, because there were some linears that were so weird the way their distortion products were that the Pure Signal predistortion wasn't working, but he's mostly got that fixed. So here's a classic two-tone test on my 25-year-old 781, and you can see that third order was down 28, which is kind of typical, and that's even a 32 volt rig. 34 dB if we go PEP. And there's the same test with my noise generator, and good, 28 dB there. It starts the distortion product, so let's just superimpose them. There's a two-tone test and there's a white noise test, and they're virtually identical. But I think the white noise test sort of shows you like that's kind of how wide we are part of the time. CW can be broad also, and so it depends on the rise time. If it's too fast, it gets broad, and if it's slower rise time, it's not near as much key clicks. There can easily be a 20 dB difference, so I measured using the Ten-Tec Omni 7. You go into the menu, you can adjust it from 3 to 10. And so here's how I measured it with the spectrum analyzer. The top one is with it at 3, and the bottom one is at 10. And there at 700 hertz offset, it's 20 dB difference. I also measured that with a K3 as the receiver instead of a spectrum analyzer, and I got 22 dB difference. So, it's a valid number, and the width really can spread out. A lot of rigs today are adjustable. That's good, but I can't understand the choices. The OEM should not be giving you a choice to pick 1 millisecond. I don't think even 4 milliseconds is okay. And I just a few months ago tested a $7,000 rig with a 1.5 millisecond rise time. It was almost 5 kcs wide at minus 60 dB. That's just crazy. Now they're fixing that, but if I go into my Kenwood and I pick 1 millisecond, I shouldn't be allowed to do that. I know Elecraft tells me that they won't let you adjust it because they're not going to let you do that and set it at 1 or 2 milliseconds. So we've got a wide range of rigs from $1,000 to almost $15,000. Obviously, we've got plenty of rigs that do well. Probably the top 10 or 20 you'd be very happy with on the air, and again, contest situations. And we need input from testing. We need input from contesters. And at the end of the day, it's a hobby. Hopefully, we enjoy using our radio, because if you have the radio, you say, this is the best radio, but I hate using it. Why would you do that? So have fun with your radio, have fun with your contesting, and have a good evening.